I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of Youth-Nex, the UVA Center to Promote Effective Youth Development. Youth-Nex was founded in 2009 to expand and apply the science of positive youth development to address fundamental challenges facing societies around the world. Through science and community partnerships, Youth-Nex enhances the strengths of children and adolescents and prevents developmental risk. Our vision is that our nation's youth, a rich and often untapped resource, may flourish. While we meet today on a virtual platform, we would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that each of us are on today. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the First Nations people that call this land home. In addition, Youth-Nex is housed within the University of Virginia, an institution built and supported by enslaved people. We recognize the enslaved men, women, and children and their ancestors, and commit to working to redress the inequities and white supremacy that result from the history of our institution. So today, we would also like to thank our generous co-sponsors who are supporting this virtual panel and its important work. A special thanks to Education Research Lectureship Series supported by the VEST program, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the School of Education and Human Development, the UVA Division for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the UVA Department of Psychology, the UVA Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, the Serpentine Society, and Seville Pride. We're grateful for your partnership, and I feel particularly grateful to see the wide array of co-sponsors we had today. It was incredibly exciting to see the interest in this particular panel and topic as we reached out and just got a flood of interest in co-sponsoring this event with us. So thank you. I would also like to note for those of you who are here in Charlottesville that this is Pride Week. And while most events did occur earlier this week, and there's no large Saturday or Sunday event this year due to COVID, you can check out their schedule for events this weekend and ongoing programming, including youth programs, available on their website. So this virtual panel will be discussing the recent National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Consensus Study Report that identifies the need for heightened attention to the social and structural inequities that exist for LGBTQI+ people. The authors of this report argue for new research on the full range of sexual and gender diversity. Our panelists and authors will also highlight the ways in which these issues relate to youth development and education. So now please join me in welcoming our panelists for today. Dr. Stephen Russell is Priscilla Pond-Flawn Regents Professor in Child Development and Chair of the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences, and Amy Johnson McLaughlin, Director of the School of Human Ecology at the University of Texas, Austin. That is a man who wears many hats. He is expert in adolescent and young adult health with a focus on sexual orientation and gender identity. He's also served on the governing boards of the Society for Research in Child Development, the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States, the National Council on Family Relations, where he was elected a fellow, and the Society for Research on Adolescence as president from 2012 to 2014. Dr. Tonia Poteat is an associate professor of social medicine, core faculty in the Center for Health Equity Research, and a clinical provider certified in HIV medicine and gender affirming clinical care at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her research, teaching, and clinical practice focus on HIV and LGBTQ health, with particular attention to the role of intersectional stigma in driving health inequities. She has more than 20 years of experience providing medical care for transgender adults and people living with HIV. She's also conducted community engaged research with LGBTQ adults for more than a decade. Dr. Andrew Flores is Assistant Professor of Government at the School of Public Affairs and a visiting scholar at the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law. His research focuses on attitude formation, attitude change, and public policies affecting LGBTQ populations. His research has appeared or is forthcoming in Science Advances, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, American Journal of Public Health, Public Opinion Quarterly, Political Psychology, among other peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Flores is a member of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Consensus Committee on the Well-Being of Sexual and Gender Diverse Populations, as you know from his being part of this panel today. He's also a member of the Working Group on Violence in Sexual and Gender Minorities convened by the National Institutes of Health. His interests are in LGBTQ politics and policy, race, ethnicity and politics, public opinion and political behavior representation, data visualization, data science, and political methodology. And Dr. Charlotte Patterson, who's here at UVA, is professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. Her research focuses on the role of sexual orientation in human development and family lives, particularly the study of child development in lesbian and gay parented families. She co-edited the Handbook of Psychology and Sexual Orientation, published by Oxford University Press, and the prize-winning report from the Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, which you'll be hearing more about today. A fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Association for Psychological Science. She's past president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Sexual Gender Minority Issues, and has been the recipient of a number of awards, including APA's distinguished contributions to research in public policy. Now I invite Dr. Patterson to kick off our panel.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, all those introductions, in fact. And many thanks to Nancy Deutsch, of course, and to all the folks at Youth-Nex for making this event possible, as indeed to all of our sponsors making this event possible. More Americans than ever are identifying themselves as LGBTQ today, and the numbers are growing. In fact, our best estimates suggest that more than 11 million Americans identify as LGBTQ+, and there are more of us every single day. With this in mind, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine commissioned a report on the well-being of LGBTQ people in the United States, and that's what we're here today to discuss. As we begin, it's a pleasure to share with you that this report has just been recognized by GLAMA, the National Association of Health Professionals and Healthcare Providers. Every year, GLAMA recognizes a person or an event that with their Special Achievement of the Year award. And this year, GLAMA has chosen to recognize this report with the 2021 Achievement Award. Each member of today's panel has contributed mightily to the strengths of this report, and I'm grateful both for their efforts and for the recognition that GLAMA has seen fit to confer on them. And now to the report. In the next slide, please. So the first question to ask here is, what are the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and what do they do? Many of us don't really know very much about the National Academies unless and until we get involved with them. In fact, many people see the academies as a federal institution, but they are in fact nonprofit, independent institutions. The National Academies of Science were founded, believe it or not, in 1853. It has been many years. And then later, this National Academy of Engineering, and now the National Academy of Medicine. They're chartered to offer unbiased, authoritative advice, evidence-based recommendations on important topics of the day that can be enlightened, if you will, by science, engineering, and medicine. Our evidence-based recommendations are provided by carefully composed committees of experts that help policymakers and others to make more informed decisions. They do this by writing reports, doing workshops, putting on all kinds of different things like this. And in the next slide, you'll see this carefully composed group of experts. Can we have the next slide, please? This is the list of study committee members for this report, and I've put in green those of us who are here today to share with you some of the findings. But as you can see, this is a very, if you know these individuals, this is a very outstanding group of experts who offer many, many different kinds of expertise relevant to the report. And it's a pleasure to work with and to be here with some of the members of the panel today. I want to acknowledge particularly Martin Jose Sepulveda, who was my co-chair for this work and who has added tremendously to this report. In the next slide, there were also a number of project staff at the National Academies and a consultant par excellence in addition. And we offer our great thanks to them as well for envisioning, supporting, and really continuing to make this report possible. Specifically, Jordan White was the study director for this project, and others, as you see, worked with her and supervised the project. And Kellen Baker was our inimitable and fantastic consultant for the project. Next slide, please. Let me show you a little bit, if I may, about the way this project was accomplished. We began, actually the Academies began in spring of 2019 with the planning and organization and recruitment of the panel. That in itself is a big, big job. There were 4 in-person meetings, 3 of them in Washington, D.C., 1 at Woods Hole, very memorable to those of us on the panel, in part because it took place during a gigantic storm. And we'll tell you more about that later if you're interested, but it's not substantive to the proposal. To the committee's great credit, they managed to work through a storm that knocked out power, flooded streets, and so forth, and still get the job done. After the last meeting, which as you see, we were fortunate to have in February of 2020, my university shut down early in March 2020. So you can see we were very lucky to get that accomplished in that time frame. The rest of the review and revision process occurred through the internet, email. It was originally released in October 2020 as a report online, and the printed copy became available early in 2021. So this is this year's report. Next slide, please. Oh, and this is what it looks like. If you have the written report in front of you, this is what the front of the paperback book looks like, created by the Academies and presumably to suggest some of the variations in lives and individuals that we considered. Next slide, please. I want to also acknowledge our sponsors for this report, without whom it could not have happened. It's a very expensive process, of course, to organize all of this and support it. And the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Gilead Foundation, and really a shout out to the National Institutes of Health, Sexual and Gender Minority Research Office in supporting this. Also the Tawani Foundation and the Tegan and Sarah Foundation, all supporters of our work, for which we are, of course, very grateful. There is a project page online for this project at thenationalacademies.org, which shows you, if you're interested in details about certain elements of our work. Some of the panels that we had, workshops, were open to the public and were recorded and are available there if you'd like further detail. Next slide, please. So here's an overview of the charge that the Academies gave to the committee. First, we were to undertake a consensus study, and we'll come back to those terms in just a second, that will review the available data and research needs on persons of diverse sexualities and genders as to say, not simply LGBT or Q plus people, but also those whose behaviors might put them underneath this umbrella, even though identities might or might not, such as MSM. And persons with differences in sex development, which often called intersex, were included as well in this report. And we were to look at all of this along multiple intersecting dimensions of well-being across the life course, the entire life course. This is a very broad charge, as you can see. And as I said earlier, this is a consensus study, a kind of unique term to the National Academies, I think. But what it meant was that each member of the panel needed to agree to every word of the report. So that's, quite a charge. Next slide, please. And here are the domains that the Academies charged us with examining. The areas of focus were to include families and social relationships, patterns of stigma, violence, victimization, and so forth, as you see this list. Today, we'll deal with the items that are in green as of special interest to this group, we hope. Families, social relationship, education, health, population health and well-being, social change, and geographic variations in public attitudes and public policies. This is, again, a very broad charge. And so you can see that any one of these topics could be expanded very dramatically and deserves much longer treatment. But we were charged with a treatment of all of them in one report. Next slide, please. One of the things I'd like to mention as we begin is our use of the term sexual and gender diverse in this report. I'd just like to say, and I believe that we all share this on the panel, this view, what we are not doing is proposing this as yet another acronym in this area. We have enough, as they say, alphabet soup already. The term sexual and gender diverse is intended to cover the usual terms that we use in this area, sexual and gender diverse, LGBTQ, and so forth, but also to acknowledge the emerging and new identities that appear all the time, and that are in use by some groups and not by others, and so forth, including things like genderqueer, gender fluid, bigender, pardon me, same gender loving, and so forth, and new terms that are probably being invented as we are meeting today. So as we use this term, sexual and gender diverse, we're hoping to cover this broad spectrum of natural human variation in sexual orientation, gender identity, and sexual development. Next slide, please. And let me just give one very brief moment's overview of the recommendations for the report so that you'll see where we're headed before I cede the stage to the next speaker. This is a kind of overview of a larger number of recommendations. One of the recommendations, of course, has to do with the collection of additional data. We really need more data in this area for many, many areas and reasons. And that will improve our well-being, no doubt, in itself. We also need to improve measurement in this area, and I'm happy to say that this recommendation has already been taken up, and there is now a new panel at the National Academies examining these measures specifically. So that's very exciting. We also need to fill data gaps with rigorous and innovative research across all the domains of well-being that we have mentioned already. We also have recommended that the government and private stakeholders work together to facilitate data access and especially data linkages and data use. We'd like to see the data that are available today and that hopefully will become available in the time ahead of us, used by researchers and available to researchers for use, and to be linked up with existing data sets so that they can become as useful as possible for our purposes here. And finally, then, another overriding recommendation is to expand evidence-based programming and intervention. We need to prioritize research on services to these communities, programs and interventions that will help sexual and gender diverse populations to improve their overall well-being. So these are just a few overviews of recommendations, and you'll hear more detail in just a moment. And I want to now cede the floor to our next speaker.
Thank you, Charlotte. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Flores, and today I was asked to present to you some of our findings, recommendations, and conclusions regarding the demography of sexual and gender diverse populations, as well as some on social attitudes and public opinion. Though in Q&A, I can also speak to the law and legal systems and aspects of violence toward LGBTQ plus individuals, among other topics. Next slide, please. So you've already seen this slide, but I bring it back because of the terminologies that have been used to kind of under the umbrella of say who may be sexually and gender diverse. And I raise this as an important component when it comes to the study of youth and the development of new terms, as Dr. Patterson emphasized. And I think it's just worth noting that when it comes to population data and data collection efforts, that the measurement of the diversity of sexual and gender diverse people can sometimes lag behind the development of new terms, in part because the ability for survey researchers to develop measures that would adequately and accurately and reliably measure some of these new emergent identity and behavioral categories takes time and sensitivity. So what you'll see in most demographic studies where you're looking at, say, the general population, is that you may find some identity terms that tend to cover a broad subset of individuals who are within, say, the LGBTQI plus population, and largely in regards to orientation identification, and more recently identifying as transgender or gender nonconforming, but yet still potentially lags. Part of the concern here when it comes to measurement is if you're looking at the general population, is making sure that the individuals who are LGBTQ plus when are asked these questions do identify in such a way in response to those questions. But the other harm to measurement validity is making sure that those who are not LGBTQI plus do not accidentally indicate in these data that they are. And so when it comes to new terms, it's important to understand, does the general population understand these terms? And if you were to ask a question in a survey, will some people not understand these terms and accidentally self-identify? And so that is why measurement is incredibly important. And so sometimes youth kind of maybe developing and using new terms may look at, say, population data and may see terms that may not necessarily match and it's really just because, you know, as good social scientists, we're trying to acquire accurate, reliable, and valid data. Next slide, please. And speaking of LGBTQI plus populations and the demography of LGBTQI plus populations, as Dr. Patterson emphasized already, is that visibility of LGBTQI plus people and other sexual and gender diverse people is growing, is increasing. This is things that you may see in mass media and popular media, But this is also in terms of the number of individuals in the population who are self-defining, say as LGBT, or self-identifying in some way that is not cisgender and not heterosexual. And so that means this is a dynamic and fluid population. And as such, the demography of this population is under flux, which is both exciting as a researcher because it means that we're learning new things about LGBTQI plus people on a very much a routine basis. Most importantly, when it comes to age and generational cohort, younger generations are identifying as LGBTQI plus at greater rates than older generations. This means that the population of LGBTQI plus people is growing to be more racially and ethnically diverse than prior studies have indicated, and incredibly dynamic. It's also important to understand that LGBT sexual and gender diverse populations cut across numerous socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, geographic location. And as such, when we speak about sexual and gender diversity, we are speaking to an incredibly diverse and intersected population. And as such, to understand well-being requires numerous frameworks, including intersectional frameworks that helps us understand the unique social locations where some LGBTQI plus people may be, and how that may differ from other LGBTQI plus people. And we tried in our report to kind of embrace that diversity and carry that with us throughout the entire document. Importantly, just because of that vast amount of diversity does mean that LGBTQI plus people reside in various locations where public policies and law, as well as societal acceptance varies. And so it's important to understand that kind of contextual variation because it may situate and help explain, say, the unique experiences of an individual in a potentially hostile climate. So of course, any demographic study and documentation of LGBTQI plus people is incredibly complicated by just the rapidly changing trends that are occurring in terms of who is identifying and documenting that change. And so it is complicated, but as I would note, it's also very exciting. Whenever I produce a study following this report or prior to this report documenting population demography, it's always important to understand that this was just a snapshot of one point in time and allow a few years to go beyond data collection, and the population may have changed, and those statistics may have changed. Also, as society changes, both in the legal and policy landscape, as well as in societal acceptance, you may see that those varying environments, both over time and across the country, that you may find that those different climates may also provide different situations in which one may feel that they can self-identify as LGBTQI plus had that environment not been changed. Importantly though, our study does conclude that while data collection has improved in terms of understanding LGBTQI plus populations, there is still a widespread lack of data collection. And importantly, when it comes to embracing the diversity, say, of LGBTQI plus people and sexual and gender diverse populations, particularly when it comes to documenting intersex status. Next slide, please. With that being said, as I had noted, data collection has expanded. We are seeing just recently, I will note that the Household Pulse survey commissioned by the US government, which is to understand the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, began documenting just recently a person's sexual orientation and gender identity. And so what we're seeing is an expansion of data collection, and that will help us understand to a much more greater detail people's experiences and at the intersections of sexuality and gender identity. However, even with that expansion, we do note that that public data sets such as the Pulse survey and private data sets such as those commissioned by numerous news agencies, as well as say numerous private data collection polling firms, do not necessarily and consistently document a person's sexual orientation and gender identity. Other research studies involving, say, clinical trials also seldom document one's sexual orientation or gender identity. And when it comes to administrative data collection, for example, when it comes to documenting incidents of violence and crime, that we do see that unless if it's in the context of hate crime, that a person's sexual orientation or gender identity is not necessarily documented. And so this does limit our ability to have solid data in order to identify patterns that may help us situate and understand the well-being of sexual and gender diverse people. Next slide, please. With that being said, we do have good data points on, say, the identification of LGBT. And here we have just the General Social Survey and the National Health Interview Survey, two population-based surveys, but serving different purposes. And we consistently see that if we look at the distribution of LGBT, people who identify as LGBT, that we see that bisexual women tend to comprise the largest share of identifiers, and that bisexuals in general tend to hold, say, if you were to look at just the breakdown of LGBT identification, that bisexual people are the largest share of identifiers. And what we can see across these data points, these pie charts that you have before you, is that over time, we do see that this breakdown kind of is consistent. So even though the population is growing, we do see, at least in these snapshots of time, that if you look within the umbrella of LGBT identification, that these categories are relatively stable in terms of the breakdown. I will note, though, that age does play an important factor here, as younger people are more likely to identify as LGBTQ. And interestingly, recent data also show that if you even look among younger people, that the category that is still largest among LGBT identification is in that bisexual category. Next slide, please. Importantly as well, to understand the changing context is that social attitudes around sexuality and gender have changed dramatically. This is just a time series plot from the 1970s to the present day on just the general acceptance of homosexuality in the United States. And here you see the amount of the percent of individuals saying that homosexuality is always wrong has sharply declined, whereas the percent of individuals saying it's not wrong at all has sharply increased. And we see these data points across numerous surveys kind of indicating just the vast amount of social change that has happened in the United States. Next slide, please. With that being said, it is important to take into consideration the various geographic environments that people find themselves in. And we do see that the propensity to identify as LGBT does vary with by state. And even if you look within the state, you see that there is some substantial variation in terms of urban rural environments and the propensity for individuals to identify. Layered with that is also that as society has changed, society has not changed uniformly as it relates to LGBT people. The maps on the right are public attitudes around favoring marriage equality over time. And as you see, as society has changed in its attitudes towards marriage equality to greater acceptance, that level of acceptance does vary unevenly, where you still have pockets of the South with more opposing attitudes as opposed to favorable attitudes. Geographic variation is, of course, very important because of the role of structural stigma. Basically, public attitudes and public policies can kind of create an environment, a stigmatizing environment that may enhance or increase the disparities that one may see when comparing LGBT people to non-LGBT people. And so understanding and tracking these changes is incredibly important. Next slide, please. Dr. Patterson covered many of our recommendations. In the context of demography and public opinion, we definitely recommend that we need to continue collecting data and collecting more data across various surveys, both public and private, in order to understand both the dynamics of sexual and gender diverse populations, but to more adequately and accurately describe the experiences of sexual and gender diverse populations. And of course, we need to improve measurement and continue to refine measurement. And finally, to importantly fill the data gaps that do exist. I document some aspects of public opinion and societal change. We know far less, though, about subgroups, social attitudes and understandings of subgroups within the broad umbrella term of sexual and gender diverse, where it comes to transgender and gender diverse people, and particularly intersex people. And so there's much that we need to learn, and many data gaps that need to be filled in the area of demography and social attitudes. And I think that is the end of my presentation, so I will pass it on to Dr. Russell.
Hi, I'm really glad to be here. Thanks, Andrew, Dr. Flores. I love Youth-Nex. I'm a big fan of Youth-Nex. I'm so glad that you all are doing this session. And my focus today on the next slide is I'm just going to hone in on the conclusions from the section on education. And maybe if it hasn't already happened, someone can put in the link for the attendees, the link to the report where you can download the report for free. You just have to give your email to the National Academies, and they're friendly and they send really terrific science stuff, and not that often. So don't worry about getting spam from the National Academy. I'm just going to dive into each one of these conclusions. And so I'll go to the next slide and say the first conclusion is that stuff that we know, and we've known for a long time, is that many sexual and gender diverse students experience discrimination or victimization, or we think of it as bullying when we think of young people, in education environments from K-12 through higher education. And we know that these experiences are strongly linked to vulnerabilities with respect to mental behavioral health and academic achievement. I feel like it's important to underscore there's been the science in this area for a while. The National Academy now says it's true. And an important thing that is so exciting to me about this area of education is that we have learned so much in the last 10 years about what really works, and it is distilled in this report. So we know that discrimination, bullying matters. We know that these experiences affect mental and behavioral health and academic achievement and pathways. A couple of other things. We know that sexual and gender diverse students experience differential treatment in schools. In particular, they experience more exclusionary discipline, meaning suspension and expulsion. And those experiences, suspension, for example, there's several studies that show us that suspensions can't be explained by punishable behavior in school. So the suspensions that young people are experiencing, like the experiences of Black and brown boys in schools, the experience of queer students in schools, are more likely to be punished and more likely to be suspended or expelled. And we know that these experiences vary at the intersections, and I've already mentioned that, but we know that LGBTQ youth of color are dramatically overrepresented in exclusionary discipline, in pathways out of school and into the juvenile injustice system. Another area where we have learned quite a bit is in educational attainment, and this is an area where there's like a mixed, somewhat complicated message, where we see that sexual and gender diverse people often experienced blocked pathways to education because of the discrimination that they may experience. So literally you may experience such a negative school environment that you can't get through it, or you can't focus on it, or you can't do well. And on the other hand, some people may, as a way of a strategy, as a response to negative environments, may actually make greater investments in education. What does that mean? It means that we see patterns where LGBT people may actually be less likely to graduate from high school. But once they do graduate, those that go on to higher ed actually have higher attainment. So it's kind of a complicated, do you have the strategy of where you literally can't get to school and you don't feel safe and can't get through? Or are you the kid who copes by hanging out in the library or adopting the academic culture of the adults in the school space? We know a lot more about K-12 than we do about higher ed, but there is emerging literature in higher ed that is consistent with the literature on K-ed about the need for safety, the ways that a lack of safety or discrimination undermines well-being of sexual gender diverse people in higher ed. The second conclusion on the next slide is that we know that the adoption of inclusive and enumerated non-discrimination, anti-bullying laws and policies is associated with creating positive environments for sexual and gender diverse students, and frankly, all students from marginalized groups and all students. And we know that these laws and policies not only create a positive environment, but are associated with positive student adjustment. And there's a really important literature in the last decade that has really documented this kind of over and over again. And consistent with what Dr. Flores just shared, there is huge regional variability that matters. Where you live matters, where you grow up matters. So we know that, for example, 17 states in the District of Columbia prohibit sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination in education, but that's only 17 states. 24 states in the District of Columbia prohibit bullying motivated by a person's sexual orientation or gender identity, whereas 2 other states, Missouri and South Dakota, prohibit schools and districts from including sexual orientation and gender identity in anti-bullying policies. So you have the very opposite situation in at least 2 states. And then we have 6 states that prohibit discussion of same-sex relationships in sexual health education. We have 3 states that require it. So the point here is that it really does matter. It matters where you live. The regional variability is actually materially meaningful for how we live, how we grow up, the experiences that we have. In the report, we anticipated what has happened in the last year with the awful transgender panic, the creating a transgender panic around youth participation in athletics. And what we note in the report is that there hasn't been legal consensus about this. And we are, of course, all of us paying attention and suffering in the face of these politicized debates. The third conclusion on the next slide is that we know that that there are a number of strategies that emerged in the last decade that clearly make a difference. And so what's exciting to me about that is that we have the research knowledge, and now what we need is the public political will to create the changes that we know we need to see. We know that schools that sexual and gender diverse people as teachers have unique experiences. I'll come back to that. But I first want to say that we know that schools can take a number of steps to make a difference for school climate. Professional education and training is hugely important. Another area where you live matters. We know from the Federal School Health Profiles Survey of Principals that states range from 55% to 95% in the proportion of schools that say that staff and teachers are encouraged to have training on supporting sexual and gender diverse students. So in some states, it's 95%, almost everybody has access to training, professional development, and other states it's only 55% that say that they have that access. The other area where we've learned a lot is schooling. Obviously schooling is school clubs like Gender Sexuality Alliance clubs, where we know that it's not only the participating in one, but just having one in your school is associated with positive outcomes for all the students in the school, not just the ones that participate. And finally, school resources like inclusive curricula. We know that there's strong evidence now that inclusive school curricula contributes to safety for all students. This is an area where there's great geographic variability. And one of the ironies or dilemmas is that there are actually few good curricular examples. We know that curricular inclusion matters, but there are a few standard curricula that actually give attention to the breadth of LGBTQ people experiences and lives across the curriculum. State of Massachusetts has one that we know of, one known English and language arts curriculum, humanities curriculum for secondary level that is explicitly inclusive of sexual and gender diverse people. And sex ed is an area that's historically excluded sexual gender diverse young people and their experiences, and there's an obvious need to include sexual health education that is inclusive of all students and their needs. And then I do want to point out that sexual and gender diverse teachers themselves often navigate in that hostile work environment as teachers. And most teachers say that they feel comfortable at school, but they also say that they report hearing homophobic remarks from their peers, their own professional peers, and even some from their administrators. So we know that schooling is not just a place where students live, but it's also where professionals, teachers live. And then finally, the fourth conclusion has to do with the other actors are the parents. And we know that sexual and gender diverse people are themselves parents and they interact with schooling. And so we know that sexual gender diverse people have their own histories with school as LGBTQ people growing up themselves, and then becoming parents. They may have concerns for their kids about discrimination and stigma. And we have seen that, and what that actually means is that they seem to be more involved, and that most of the studies to date show that sexual gender diverse LGB parents become more involved in their schools, in their children's schools. But there's important variability in that mothers are more involved than fathers, that sexual gender diverse fathers are more involved than heterosexual fathers. So some of the things that we have known, and actually we know that parents are more involved in communities that they perceive to be more homophobic. So the more hostile you think your community might be, the more involved you end up getting in your child's education experience. So much of this work is focused on primary and secondary school for parents, and we need primary school for parents, and we need more work on secondary school. And I should say that we know so little about the education experiences of intersex young people. And it's an area where we definitely need, is a huge data need, is to understand education for intersex young people and the experiences of intersex people across the lifespan with respect to education. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to my colleague and friend, Tonia Poteat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Russell. I really appreciate that. So I think I am the last speaker to bring us into the question and answer session. And my goal for the next 10 minutes or so is to review the chapters on physical and mental health and on access to evidence-informed care. Whoops, now I just made myself go forward. So if somebody can help me go backwards, that would be great. Thank you. So instead of detailing each of the conclusions, because we had many, I've summarized them at the end, but provided just an overarching summary at the top. So for the physical and mental health chapter, we concluded that sexual and gender diverse populations face numerous and persistent physical and mental health disparities, which is probably not a surprise to anyone on this webinar. We found that these disparities were driven by social forces like stigma, prejudice, and discrimination, not by personal characteristics that are related to sexual orientation, gender identity, or intersex status. We also found that these disparities were unevenly distributed across race and gender and other characteristics, and they were compounded by intersecting stressors, and I'll describe what I mean by that in the next slide, like racism, sexism, xenophobia. And of course, they're exacerbated by lack of research that explicitly includes and prioritizes sexual and gender diverse populations, and particularly the lack of intervention research. Most of the intervention research that we found was focused on HIV, which is of course an important issue for LGBTQI communities. And more work is needed both on HIV as well as other health concerns in the community, and especially interventions and research that focuses on those, what we call upstream drivers or stressors that lead to the health disparities that we see. This is based on the minority stress model, which was first developed by Virginia Brooks in relation to lesbian health, expanded by Elon Meyer to include LGB health, and recently expanded by Testa to include trans people. So overall, if you look at the left-hand side, we start with sexual and gender minority identities, as well as other targeted identities. And people experience stressors related to those identities, from stigma, discrimination, abuse related to their minority identities, and non-affirmation of their identities. And these stressors are what lead to health disparities, both physical and mental health disparities. And those disparities can be caused by discriminatory barriers to healthcare, like being refused access to gender-affirming care, for example, as well as physiological impacts that are associated with minority stress. And there's a growing body of literature looking at some of the sort of cortisol and allostatic load related impacts on the body from experiencing all the stress related to stigma and discrimination. And of course, communities are not passive recipients of stigma and discrimination. They find ways to cope, they find ways to resist by building community and finding support in families and other environments. So this is a model that really underlies why we see the health disparities that we see. And the next few slides are just going to be some snapshots of some of the data that we looked at and coming to our conclusions. So we looked at disparities facing gay and bisexual men, and hopefully you can't see this because I don't want you to go through it line by line. The important part is that we found health disparities in mental health, physical health, health diagnoses, as well as health risk behavior like smoking and drinking. When we looked at data for lesbian and bisexual women, we saw similarly health disparities across multiple axes of health, mental, physical, diagnoses, and health risks. We unfortunately found very little data for intersex adults, and I think that's been mentioned earlier. There's much more research that's needed for that population. It is estimated that a little under 2% of people have an intersex trait, and there are a wide variety of intersex traits. There was the first national study of intersex adults that was published in 2020. Participants were recruited through support groups and online communities, and there were 179 people who had complete responses. Not surprisingly to folks in the intersex community, there were a wide variety of sexual orientations and gender identities and greater diversity than what we see in other populations. So 75% identified with a sexual orientation that was not heterosexual, 16% identified as trans compared to about 0.6% of the general population, and 25% identified as non-binary. Unfortunately, we saw high rates of fair or poor mental and physical health. And this is from a self-rated health measure that has been associated with morbidity and mortality in the population. So this self-reported health measure actually tells us a lot about people's risk for adverse health in the future. And a shocking 32% had attempted suicide at some point in their lives. There's a growing body of data on health disparities faced by transgender adults, and we pulled out just a few here to highlight. In the upper left, this is the same self-reported health measure, comparing cisgender people are the green bars and transgender people as the orange or red bars, depending on your vision. And you can see for each year that this was done, transgender people experienced greater rates of fair or poor health compared to cisgender people. Right below that is data on the attempted suicides in the past year by age groups. And again, you see for every age group, we see marked disparities for transgender people. And then on the right-hand side, we see the disparities in HIV prevalence faced by transgender people compared to cisgender people, and similar to what we see in the overall population, enormous disparities by race. And because this is a youth talk, I did want to pull out specifically some of the data that we have on youth, and some of this has been covered already, but I do want to emphasize what we do know from population-based surveys. This is the risk behavior surveillance survey from 2017. And the light green bars are trans youth compared to other youth. And you can see there are enormous disparities in feeling unsafe when going to and from school, being threatened or injured with a weapon at school, being forced to have sexual intercourse or experiencing sexual or physical dating violence, being bullied at school, and being electronically bullied. And we see an enormous disparity in suicide attempts at 35%. So you'll see this as a common theme in terms of the minority stresses that people experience and what that does to their mental health. Fortunately, for young people, we do have data on what can make a difference. So for young people who are in school, a safe and supportive school environment can help. So creating and enforcing anti-bullying policies, identifying and training supportive school staff to be a resource for students can be really helpful in reducing these negative outcomes. The next chapter, we looked at access to evidence-based health services, and overall, we concluded that sexual and gender diverse populations need access to a full range of evidence-based, high-quality, preventive, chronic, and acute healthcare services similar to everyone else. These services must be delivered in a welcoming, affirming, clinically appropriate, and culturally responsive setting. Gender-affirming care, including all aspects of gender-affirming care, puberty delay medications for young people, mental health services, hormone therapy, and gender-affirming surgeries have been associated with improved mental and physical health for trans people and should be covered by insurance. Some interventions are not evidence-based and are in fact dangerous and should not be performed. Two of those are conversion therapy to change sexual orientation or gender identity, and not medically necessary or elective genital surgeries on children with intersex traits who are too young to provide consent. So we'll start with some of the drivers of some of the data that we have on discrimination experienced in healthcare in trying to access that evidence-based affirming healthcare by sexual and gender minority populations. And we have data that 20% or 1 in 5 LGBTQ people overall, and almost half of transgender people report experienced discrimination because they were LGBTQ when they went to seek healthcare from a doctor or a health clinic. 28% of people who were transgender in another study avoided seeking healthcare when they needed care, not preventive care, but they were sick, out of concern that they would be discriminated against. And more than 1 in 5 transgender people had been denied insurance coverage for preventive screenings based on their gender. For example, a trans man who needed cervical cancer screening might be denied that screening because they were a trans man. In terms of barriers at the provider level, we know that interpersonal discrimination from providers and other staff is a common experience for LGBTQ people. And we know that very few healthcare providers receive either cultural competency or clinical expertise training on LGBTQI health. And when we look within the LGBTQ community in the study that's highlighted below, trans people are much more likely to experience negative experiences in a healthcare environment compared to LGB people, even though the LGB rates are already quite high. And people experience being intentionally disrespected. Some even are physically assaulted. They experience harsh abuse language and are denied care. And I want to focus a little bit on, to close, the 2 findings around the importance of access to gender affirming care, and a little bit later on sexual orientation change strategies. So every major US medical association, including the American Medical Association, the American Academy of PAs, the American Academy of Pediatrics, nursing associations, all endorse coverage and provision of gender affirming care for trans people. And there are numerous medical standards to guide its provision, including guidelines from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, guidelines from the Endocrine Society of North America, and other medical societies. We also know that puberty delaying medications are fully reversible, and they've been used since 1990s to support gender diverse youth in exploring their gender. And this is in contrast to some of the misinformation that's been propagated around the provision of gender affirming care for youth. So I just wanted to emphasize that. Puberty delaying medications are fully reversible, and they provide time for young people to affirm their gender. Social transition refers to wearing the clothes or the physical appearance of the person's affirmed gender. And we know that socially transitioned transgender children have normal levels of depression, minimal elevation in their anxiety, and notably lower rates of internalizing psychopathology, so self-harm. And this is research that's been conducted with adolescent and pediatric trans health specialists. Finally, we know that having access to puberty delaying medications is associated with better mental health by the time someone reaches adulthood. So in summary, gender affirming care is a positive aspect of care for transgender people and should be covered by insurance and should not be prohibited by politicians. Moving on to the harmful practices that really should not be allowed. Conversion therapy tries to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity under the belief that being cisgender and heterosexual are the only normal ways to be. Most major US medical associations condemn this practice, and more states are prohibiting it, which is great. So in the map that you see below, the dark green indicates the states that currently prohibit it, and then the light, I guess, tan states are ones that don't have laws yet. So hopefully we'll see more and more efforts to prevent this harmful practice from being implemented, especially against young people. Genital surgeries on intersex infants has actually been considered a human rights abuse by the United Nations. We do know that some intersex infants and children will require genital surgery to address urinary obstruction, exposed pelvic organs, or other medically necessary conditions. However, early genital surgery is often performed to make parents more comfortable, to try to make the child sort of fit in and be quote unquote normal, rather than because of a medical need. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of evidence regarding what happens when children don't have surgery, because most of the research follows children who have had surgery. The data that we do have on these early genital surgeries that are done without a medical indication provide mixed evidence of physical benefit, almost no evidence of psychosocial benefit, and strong evidence of irreversible harm to the child, especially psychological harm. And as I already mentioned, is considered an infringement on human rights because obviously they're performed without consent of the child. So in conclusion, I have provided all of our overarching conclusions from both of the chapters that I've outlined already: numerous disparities in physical and mental health, gaps in research and data collection, disparities being driven by social forces and intersecting stressors, and a greater need for intervention research. And that people need access to clinically appropriate and culturally responsive care, access to gender affirming care that improves mental and physical health for trans people, prevention of harmful conversion therapy, and dangerous surgeries that are unnecessary on intersex infants. So with that, I will turn it over to whoever's going to take us to the next section.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you. I actually believe we are out of time, and I apologize. I was monitoring the Q&A box, however, and so it looks like we are okay on that. But I want to thank our panelists, thank all of our co-sponsors for today. And as a reminder, you can access the video from the panel on the Youth-Nex YouTube channel. Feel free to follow us on social media to learn more about other events throughout the year. And yeah, I just want to again reiterate my gratitude for all of the panelists today and for their work on this important report. So thank you all for joining us. And for the panelists, we do have that small grad